In the lecture today, we're going to explore the political economic governance of the Spanish Empire. It's important to understand the history of the Spanish Empire, as it was the first global empire. At the end of the 15th century, the Western European Atlantic powers, Spain and Portugal, were engaged in competition to find new trade routes to the commodity markets in Asia, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as the late medieval spice race. When the Portuguese sailor Bartolomé Diaz sailed to the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he opened a new sea route to the Indian Ocean around the coast of Africa. This led the Spanish rulers to invest in the risky and expensive enterprise of finding a westerly sea route to the east. This led to the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. They were indebted and in search of commercial gain. We're familiar with images like this one on the slide, a map of the territories claimed by Spain, and historical events such as Hernán Cortés's military defeat of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan from 1519 to 1525, and Francisco Pizarro's invasion of the Inca Empire in the Andes in 1532. However, the process of attempting to establish a global empire was much more complicated than a series of military defeats. Law, and especially laws promulgated to regulate economic practices, played a vital role in developing articulation of sovereignty in the Americas and in the everyday practices of governance. Significantly, the construction of the legal ecology of empire was not a one-way process. People used the law to petition the crown for justice, for political and economic resources. This created opportunities for resistance and for the negotiation of spheres of autonomy. Consequently, the image that you see on the slide depicting the geographical reach of the Spanish Empire is also misleading, as it does not capture how political authority was contested and negotiated at the local level. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they encountered a people whom they had not known existed. This raised moral and ontological questions. Who were these people? Were they fully human? Could they become Christians? How should they be treated? Columbus described the people as simple, like animals even, and he enslaved some people and transported them to Spain. However, in 1500, the Spanish monarchs issued a royal order that the indigenous people of the Americas that had been brought from the Caribbean islands and put up for sale as slaves were free and should be returned to their country of origin. The Spanish monarchs did not say that the indigenous people were independent, but claimed that they were Spanish subjects. This early royal ruling against the enslavement of indigenous Americans did not prevent their abuse and dispossession, but it did shape the ways in which the labour and resources could be appropriated. It also meant that indigenous Americans were political subjects and could use law to negotiate with imperial authorities. The image you see on the slide here is from the Tlaxcala Codex, a petition by the people of Tlaxcala, now in Mexico. This Tlaxcala Codex is now held in the University of Glasgow's special collections. Despite the formal ruling against the enslavement of indigenous Americans, there remain certain legal pathways to their enslavement. One of those was the category of rescate, people classed as rescued, including those who were seen to have been already enslaved prior to the arrival of the Spanish. Children were particularly vulnerable to this form of enslavement. Another of these was cautivos, people captured in so-called just war. Beyond the formal institution of slavery, there were other ways indigenous people had their labour appropriated. In 1501, Nicolas de Ovando, third governor of the Indies, established the encomienda system, a system of labour tribute or taxation that was often scarcely different to slavery. In the Andes, this was known as the mita system. The word encomienda came from encomendar, meaning to entrust. Encomienda contracts leased indigenous labour to encomenderos as a kind of tribute or taxation. Encomenderos did not own the indigenous people, and their labour leases could not be bought, sold, or inherited. The labour leases were designed by the Spanish crown not only to control the labour of indigenous Americans, but to limit the development of entrenched power of the Spanish settlers. The encomienda system was formalised by the laws of Burgos, issued in 1512, in the name of protecting indigenous Americans from abuse. Imperial laws use the rhetoric of care and public good to make the subjugation of Indigenous people and the appropriation of their labour seem morally and politically just. In 1542, the Crown issued the new laws of the Indies. The encomienda labour tribute system was replaced by a new tribute system called repartimiento, a term derived from repartir, to allot or distribute. The new laws acknowledged the abuses of the encomienda system, but were not intended as an end to the tax on Indigenous labour. Article 42 ruled the tributes of newly discovered Indians are to be fairly assessed and delivered to the royal treasurer. The new laws that reformed Indigenous labour tax were designed to strengthen sovereign authority. Like encomienda, the repartimento system was open to abuse and did not prevent the appropriation of Indigenous labour by colonial settlers. These forced labour systems of Indigenous Americans existed alongside parallel systems of different types of forced labour of Black people. In 1501, the first enslaved Black people transported from Africa arrived in the Americas. According to the Slave Voyages database, it is estimated that around 6,363 Africans were taken to the Spanish Empire between 1501 and 1525. This number rose to 23,375 in the 1526 to 1550 period. The institution of slavery in the Spanish Empire was different to the type of chattel slavery developed by the British Empire later. Slavery was not a fixed or hereditary state in the Americas, and while Black people often arrived in the Americas enslaved, and not only this, there were also large communities of free Black people in the Spanish Empire. Black people were also taxed differently in the Spanish Empire. Enslaved Black people were not considered full political subjects and consequently were not subject to taxation. Free Black people, however, were subject to taxation. Yet this extraction was not always viewed negatively, since it was viewed as a recognition of their political subjectivity. However, people also tried to claim they were from another socio-political group, for example, mestizo, people who had mixed Spanish and Indigenous heritage, in order to avoid certain taxations. In this way, taxation was a tool of articulating and governing differences across imperial spaces. In addition to the previously mentioned labour tribute of the encomienda and repartimento systems, Indigenous people were also subject to another form of colonial taxation, and these outlasted the decline of encomienda and repartimento. In the 1550s and 60s, the cabecera sujeto, head town and subject town system was created. Head towns collected taxes from subject towns. Population data for the tax bill was often overestimated, often intentionally, resulting in increasing tax demands falling on fewer and increasingly poorer subjects. And this resulted in petitions from sujetos for autonomy. In this way, the political economy of the Spanish Empire created forms of economic poverty, which also shaped the political landscape of the Spanish Empire from the bottom up. The political economy of taxation also contributed to the transformation of Indigenous agroecologies. For example, taxes could be requested in cash or in kind. If they were requested in cash, the communities would have to find ways to monetize parts of their local economy to meet the payments. In some cases, communities were requested to pay their taxes in wheat. In this case, Indigenous communities could shift their production from maize, which was the traditional form of agricultural production, to wheat, or they could try to buy it from somewhere else in order to meet the payments. In this way, the colonial taxation regime could also transform Indigenous agricultural practices and their surrounding ecologies. Imperial tax systems increased inequalities in the New World. Different people were taxed differently. Wealthier Indigenous people, referred to as caciques or lords, or certain office holders, could be exempt from direct taxation. Some of these wealthier Indigenous people could buy their way out of labour tributes, while poorer groups, known as masawalas or commoners, who could not make any payments in kind, might have to work more, leading to the neglect of their own lands and agricultural production and increasing their chances of falling into economic poverty. In The Art of Not Being Governed, James Scott described human history as a series of state-making processes characterized by sedentarization and taxation, and attempts by people to flee these coercive, extractive regimes. In the Spanish Empire, flight and migration from the countryside to the city was an important tool of indigenous resistance and a mechanism for evading excessive taxation. There was also a strong political culture of petitioning across the Spanish Empire. The Crown recognized Indigenous people, and as such, they could also petition the Crown for certain privileges and also charity according to their status. In the 1542 New Laws of the Indies, the Spanish monarch Charles V ordered that Indigenous Americans should petition directly on matters of justice, underlining the way in which the distribution served to reinforce the sovereign's position as the ultimate provider of justice in the imperial context. Many Indigenous petitions concerned socioeconomic rights, especially disputing the imperial tax burden. The example you see on the slide is taken from the Kingsborough Codex and shows an Indigenous petition against excessive taxation. Across urban and rural communities, confraternities, a type of lay religious institution, became a central resource for people across the socioeconomic and proto-racial spectrum of colonial society. These confraternities help people in urban and rural communities to form and consolidate social bonds and economic resources, offering an important opportunity for pooling capital and fostering solidarity. These institutions offered mechanisms to avoid taxation, and as private individuals, they could then make charitable donations and avoid taxation. They would receive, in return, forms of community membership and risk management. So from its inception, global imperialism emerged as a legal entity. In the case of the Spanish Empire, the Spanish Crown recognized Indigenous Americans as political subjects with rights to their freedom and property. This did not prevent Indigenous abuse and dispossession, but made the role of law and the structures of political governance important to the way imperialism was experienced and negotiated. From the start, despite the fact that Indigenous Americans were recognized as Crown subjects, the oppressive labor tributes of encomienda and repartimento indicated that Indigenous people were to be treated differently from Spanish settlers. The political economic governance of imperial taxation helped create new forms of proto-racial inequality. There were many Black people of different status in the Spanish Empire, free and unfree, and the political economic governance of taxation also helped to establish and maintain differences in empire. Despite the Spanish Empire's attempt to establish and maintain strict inequalities, there were multiple opportunities for mutability and for resistance. People may be familiar with the 18th century genre of paintings known as the casta paintings, appearing on the slide here. These depicted rigid socioeconomic and moral hierarchies within the Spanish Empire. Yet these paintings are also misleading. They project an idealized colonial vision of imperial inequalities that was never fully realized, as attempts to categorize people in certain ways and appropriate resources were also resisted, sometimes overtly through uprisings, flight, and the establishment of autonomous communities beyond the reach of empire, and sometimes more subtly through everyday acts of resistance and the use of law to negotiate the tax burden and other injustices.